Prologue, Shadows and Glass. The house stood on the slopes of the mountain, like a glass crystal lost among the dense Carpathian spruces. The evening was falling on the valley in full, coloring the sky a deep purple color. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, giving way to feelings. Inside, the smell of sandalwood, expensive leather and the faint aroma of smoke from the fireplace. Elina, 23 years old, stood by the panoramic window. She was wearing a pearl-colored silk dress that softly hugged her fragile figure. She held a glass of red wine, watching the first drops of rain begin to break against the glass. Elina was an artist, she saw the world through the prism of colors and shadows, but tonight promised her something more than just visible pleasure. Laughter came from the depths of the living room. It was Katya, 24 years old, her complete opposite. Bright, with a mop of dark hair and a look that could light a fire. Katya sat on the soft rug by the fireplace, sorting through her collection of vinyl records. "You've been staring at the rain for too long, Eli," a low male voice said. Mark, 25 years old, approached Elina. Tall, with broad shoulders and calm movements. He was the architect of this house, and his presence always felt like a reliable support. He stood next to her, not touching, but Elina felt the warmth of his body from a distance of a few centimeters. "I'm just on the day off," she answered quietly, not taking her eyes off the window. "This evening, it seems special." "It is," Mark answered, his voice becoming quieter, more intimate. "Because we are here alone." Part 1, Candlelight Dinner. The table was set simply but elegantly. Dark wood, white candles, the reflections of which danced in the glasses. The fourth participant in this symphony was Dan, 24 years old, a photographer, a man of the moment. His amber eyes were always looking for beauty, and now they were fixed on Katya. "You know," Dan began, pouring wine, "there is a theory that we truly get to know a person not through words, but through silence. Through the way they breathe next to you, how they hold their fork, how they react to a random touch." Katya smiled, biting off a piece of figure. Her lips were shiny with juice. "Silence can be dangerous, Dan. There is too much truth in it." "And are we afraid of the truth?" Mark asked, looking at Elina across the table. The room was thick with tension, sweet as honey. It wasn't the first time they'd played this game, but today the stakes were higher. The rain outside the window had intensified, turning the world outside into a blurry watercolor, cutting them off from reality. It was just the four of them, the warmth of the fireplace, and the faint jazz emanating from the record player. Elina felt Mark's knee lightly brush her leg under the table. It wasn't a random movement. It was a question. She didn't move away. It was an answer. After dinner, the lights were dimmed. Only the glow of the fireplace and a few floor lamps in the corners remained. Dan turned on the slow, drawn-out melody of the saxophone. "Shall we dance?" He held out his hand to Katya. She stood up gracefully, like a cat. When Dan put his hand on her waist, the space between them disappeared. They moved slowly, barely swaying. Katya rested her head on his shoulder, inhaling the scent of his perfume, a mix of tobacco and citrus. Her fingers slid slowly down his back, feeling the tension of the muscles under his thin shirt. At the other end of the room, by the glass wall, Mark approached Elina. "You're shivering," he whispered, brushing a strand of blonde hair from her face. His fingers were warm and rough, contrasting with her delicate skin. "I'm not cold," Elina breathed. "I know." Mark leaned closer. His lips were almost at her ear. "It's electric." He hugged her from behind, his arms crossed over her stomach. Elina leaned her head back against his shoulder, closing her eyes. She could feel his heart beating in unison with her own. His breath tickled her neck, sending shivers down her spine. It was a moment of pure aesthetics. No rush. Just the awareness of another's presence. Mark kissed her neck slowly, his lips barely touching, as if tasting the skin. Elina took a deep breath, her fingers gripping his forearm. They moved to the rug by the fireplace. The bottle of wine was already half empty. The atmosphere had become more relaxed, but at the same time more charged. "Let's play," Katya suggested, her eyes shining in the semi-darkness. "But not with words. With feelings." "What do you mean?" Dan asked, his gaze fixed on her. "Everyone should do something nice for the other. No words. Only actions. The one who takes the action cannot open his eyes." The idea was risky, but in this house, on this night, the rules of the outside world did not apply. Elina was the first to sit down. She sat in the center, her eyes closed. The darkness heightened her senses. She heard the crackling of wood, the sound of rain, and soft footsteps on the rug. She felt someone sit down behind her. It was Mark. She knew it without even seeing him. He carefully took her hands in his. He began to massage her palms, slowly running his thumb along each lifeline. It was so intimate, so gentle, that Elina's breath caught in her throat. Then his hands rose higher, to her wrists, where a vein throbbed. He pressed his lips to that pulse for a moment. "Your heart beats like a bird," he whispered so softly that only she could hear. Meanwhile, Dan and Katya were in their own world. Dan lay down on the carpet, resting his head on Katya's lap. She slowly ran her fingers through his hair, her nails lightly scratching his scalp, causing waves of relaxation. She leaned down low, and their gazes met in an inverted reflection. "You're beautiful," Dan said. Not as a compliment, but as a statement of fact. He raised his hand and traced the contour of her lips. Katya barely opened her mouth, lightly biting his finger. The air between them sparked. The night was deepening. The rain had turned into a downpour, cutting them off from the rest of the world for good. Mark stood up and offered Elina his hand. "Come on," he said. He led her to the terrace, which was covered but open to the forest. The air was cool and humid, a stark contrast to the heat of their bodies. There was a hot tub there, steam rising from it. When they were alone, surrounded by steam and night, the barriers fell for good. Mark entered the water first, watching Elina take off her dress. In the moonlight, her skin looked like marble. She entered the water, and the warmth enveloped her. Mark pulled her close. The water hid their bodies, but not their feelings. Their skin touched, wet, hot. Elina wrapped her arms around his neck, feeling the drops of water trickle down his hair onto his face. Their kiss was long, salty from the rain and sweet from the wine. It was the kiss of two people who had waited a long time for this moment. Mark's hand slid down her back, exploring every curve, every dimple. Inside the house, by the fireplace, Dan and Katya's story took on a different hue. They lay on the carpet, staring into the fire. Dan drew invisible patterns on her bare shoulder. "Do you know what's most erotic?" Katya asked in a whisper. "What?" "Trust. The ability to be vulnerable." Dan loomed over her, peering into her very soul. He slowly unbuttoned the buttons of his shirt, tossing it aside. The heat of the fire reflected on their bodies in golden glints. When he kissed her, it was demanding, passionate, with a hunger they had been holding back all evening. The world around them narrowed to touch, breath, and the warmth of skin. The shadows on the walls danced their own, ancient dance. Morning came quietly. The rain had stopped, leaving a mist that spread between the trees. The light, pale and pure, flooded the living room. On the table stood burnt-out candles and empty glasses, witnesses to a night full of passion and revelations. Elina stood on the terrace, wrapped in Mark's blanket. She drank coffee, looking at the sunrise. Mark came out after her, hugged her from behind and rested his chin on the top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About how some nights change everything," she answered, turning to face him. Her eyes read a new depth, a new knowledge about herself and about him. Katya and Dan were still sleeping in the living room, covered with a single blanket, their limbs intertwined as one. This was a story not about the ending, but about the beginning. About the beauty of the moment when two souls and two bodies find a common language, understood without words. A story recorded by raindrops on glass and warm touches on skin.